At Cambridge University, they're finding that for very small creatures, the world is a completely different place to the one we experience. It's almost as if they're ruled by different laws of physics.
In terms of their relative strength, you might almost say that insects are superheroes. So some of the strongest ants can easily carry 4 or 5 times their own body weight, which for us is the equivalent of almost a small car if you're a relatively big human.
This is all because volume, area, and length change by different amounts when you make things smaller. The overall effect is to make small creatures much stronger than big ones, relatively speaking.
Ants supports the weight of a paintbrush, which is roughly 2.5 grams. That corresponds to around 500 times its own weight, which would be the equivalent of me for 40 tons, which is probably about 6-7 lorries. So that's really quite impressive.
But there's more to being small than strength. Now, it turns out that our old friend, the square cube law, which means that small creatures lose heat more easily because of their large surface area to weight ratio, also has an upside if you find yourself falling from height. A 5mm human falling from a countertop is equivalent to a normal-sized human falling 300 meters. So Joe can be forgiven for thinking that it's not going to end well. But it does.
So one of the very first studies that thought about the question how size matters and what the right size for an animal is, thought about the problem of why you can drop an ant down a shaft and the ant just falls down the ground and walks away. But if you would do the same to a human, the human would break. Because the ant is so small, air resistance is much more important for the ant, so the velocity with which the ant hits the ground is much slower than what would happen to a human.
Taken to an extreme, it's why rock dust floats in the air, but rocks don't, even though they're made of the same stuff. And there are even more advantages to being so small.
So one of the things we're interested in is how well insects stick. And one of the techniques we use to measure that is a centrifuge. So we take a little ant, put it on a centrifuge, and start spinning it around. And we then try and measure at what acceleration these ants actually fall off the centrifuge.
Wow.
G-force, or G, is the name for the feeling you might get on a roller coaster. In the tightest turn, you might experience 6G. But even with much higher G-forces, somehow the ants hang on.
And during these measurements, we've seen ants withstand 500G, 1000G for 10, 20, even 30 seconds, and then they fall off and walk off as if nothing happened.
It's this stickiness that allows insects to walk up the smoothest of walls, even hang on to the ceiling. So how does it work?
Insects or geckos or any animal that climbs with adhesive feet, they can't use a glue because it would take a long time to activate and deactivate. So as far as we know, climbing animals use intermolecular forces to stick to surfaces. It's still under debate what exactly these intermolecular forces are. If you have two molecules and they attract each other, then you have to convince them to split apart, and that's what helps these animals to stick.
We experience these intermolecular sticking forces too. But at our normal human size, we're not even aware of them because they're tiny compared to gravity. But once more, being small changes the rules. A 5mm human could climb a wall just like an ant. But it's not all good news for small creatures. A 5mm human may be good at climbing, but he might not understand why he's doing it. It's a problem that affects all very small creatures. Brain size.
Our brains rely on our neurons, and it looks like that neurons remain relatively constant in size across different animals. So whether you're a very small animal or a very big animal, the neuron is approximately the same size. Now this immediately means that if you're very small, you have fewer neurons, and that might present you with a problem regarding your cognitive abilities.
The bottom line is, if you're going to get really small, you're going to lose brain power. A 5mm tall Joe would only have around 2 million neurons, which would put his ability to do crosswords somewhere between a cockroach and a small fish. He'd be smart enough to spot food, but probably not smart enough to worry about the puddle of coffee in the way. For normal-sized people, surface tension is barely noticeable, But when you're tiny, it's suddenly deadly.
Surface tension is a force that becomes very, very powerful if you're very small, and really unimportant if you're really big. So for very small animals, a droplet of water can be very dangerous, while very large animals will hardly notice the droplets.
So great. Tiny humans might be able to climb walls and carry things 100 times their own body weight, but what's the point if you're too stupid to tie your own shoelaces, constantly looking for food, and if the wasps don't kill you, the coffee will? Because if that's what being a human is, you can count me out. And I think that's the point. There is a sweet spot for human sizes that works for the way the world is now, and it's no coincidence